paint a little bit of the landscape initially. Myburgh did a study during the course of last year, and there were some very worrying trends that came out from that study, which we've seen play out during the course of this year and very much play out into our claims that we've seen on our side. The two key statistics I want to pick up from this slide is really this 53% of organizations who've experienced business interrupting ransomware attacks, which was up 20% from a year ago. We've seen a big evolution in ransomware where it's gone from relatively simple attacks to much more sophisticated attacks looking to disrupt operations both from a backup and a production environment. And over the last 3 or 4 months, we've seen an even more worrying trend on that. But I don't want to steal any of Danny's thunder. I'll leave him to talk to us through what we're seeing on that front. And then the second big one we've seen is where 73% of companies who have been the victim of an impersonation or business email compromise attack have faced direct financial losses. For what we're seeing, those are really two of the key biggest sort of threat vectors that the attackers are leveraging against companies, and very much companies in South Africa. So we're seeing a lot of this activity. So what is cyber insurance? I've often said it that this name cyber is great from a marketing perspective, but a little bit restrictive in what the policy actually incorporates. I think it's better to see it as system and data insurance. That's really quite boring and naff to use as your marketing terminology. The policy is triggered by 2 core events, the one being a network security breach and the other a privacy breach. The definition of both of those being really quite broad and incorporate things like corporate espionage, cyber extortion, denial of service attacks, downstream attacks where your environment is compromised and used to cause damage to others or cause attacks against them, hacking, which you'd expect to see on a cyber attack, malware in all its wonderful guises, from viruses to Trojans to ransomware to destructionware, all of these wonderful things. Threats posed to your environment by either using or having third parties who have access into your environment. And then the 2 here, which I think start to show just how broad the policy is insider and privilege misuse, and then physical theft and loss. So the policy very much can be triggered by a malicious employee or an individual in the organizational service provider who acts in a malicious way or uses access that they have to the environment in an unauthorized manner. If we look at what the policy actually covers, to my mind, I see it easiest as seeing the policy as having 3 kind of core pillars as such. The first one being the incident response process, and we'll unpack that in a lot more detail a little later on in the session. But that incorporates things like, and to that, sorry, we have a 24/7 emergency response hotline, which will give you access to individuals like Lee and Danny to do things like understand, has an incident occurred? What's actually happened? How do we contain this? How do we help you get your business back up and running? So all those sort of IT questions being answered and doing the investigations to see what, if any, data was compromised. Legal guidance to make sure that you don't fall foul of any regulatory requirements. We are seeing a lot of regulatory changes come through, not just from a South African perspective, but also if we look at GDPR, which has an impact on us. Crisis management costs to look after the potential reputational damage. So if all of a sudden your company is sprawled all over News 24, how do we manage the potential reputational fallout from that? Or even step before that, try and prevent you having negative press on there. Notification remediation costs, so the cost to look after those whose data is being compromised, to communicate with them, and then to give them those remediation services to try and help prevent them suffering any further damages. And then we've got the cyber extortion cover. The way the policy manages an extortion threat is step 1, look to see if that extortion threat is valid. Step 2, can we recover without paying the ransoms? And then step 3, if we can't recover without paying the ransoms, and the best course of action is going to be to actually pay that ransom, to negotiate and settle that as well. So to sum up this incident response panel, it's emergency response hotline number, gives you all the IT experts to understand, contain and recover from the incident, legal experts to make sure you don't fall foul of regulatory requirements, the PR side to manage the potential reputational damage, cost to look after those who've been affected, and then all the management costs on a cyber extortion threat. We jump across onto the second pillar, our financial impact pillar. Big selling points in a cyber insurance policy: business interruption and increased cost of working. You may have some of that cover under a traditional commercial policy, but those policies require physical or tangible damage, like a fire or a flood to trigger, and not things like a denial of service or a ransomware attack would be triggering those policies. We've also got the fines and penalties, so like your POPI and GDPR fines and penalties, but that is to the extent insurable by law. If we look at GDPR, it's not, well, GDPR, there's only about 2 Scandinavian countries where insurers are actually legally able to pay those fines and penalties. Copy is still a little bit unclear, although I suspect it's going to follow the same route as that. So while the policy does cater for being able to pay those fines and penalties, it's not yet clear if we will in the South African context. However, you'll still have the cover to make representations to the regulators and try and manage that process. If we jump across onto the last pillar, you've got your liability pillar. There you've got the defense and settlement of any ensuing litigation from data that's been compromised or where your environment has been compromised and used to cause damages to other. There's also a digital media liability element to the policy, which would be the defense and settlement from ensuing litigation as a result of unintentional defamation, copyright infringement, or infringement to right to privacy. As the risk has evolved, we have introduced some new optional extensions to the policy to bring some cover and manage some of the evolving risk landscape. So to pick out on some of these, the one that we've got is the initial response phase. So that is effectively like a deductible waiver. The insured can elect to purchase either 48 or 72 hours time period. Policy is triggered and operates the exact same way it normally would. The only difference is that your deductible on the policy only becomes applicable after that initial response phase time period has elapsed. Another very common one we're seeing in the market is outsourced service provider or OSP cover. More and more we're seeing companies going to the cloud or making use of third-party platforms. While their policy would pick up the data in those environments, this extends to bring the business interruption to that. So if you are using a cloud provider and they are attacked and they go offline, and as a result of that, you're not able to access those services, and possibly that then brings a disruption to your business operations or hampers your business operations, and you suffer a loss of earnings as a result of that, this piece of cover will cover that loss of earnings, and depending on the circumstances around it, can even extend as far as picking up the cost for you to change to an alternative service provider. E-financial loss is if you have a third party that gains unauthorized access to your environment, and as a result of that unauthorized access is able to steal money from your bank account or a bank account which you are responsible for, it picks up that financial loss. Physical damage is really just available to companies with a turnover below 250 million rand at the moment, but is our initial steps into picking up physical damage as a result of unauthorized access to a network, and becoming really relevant now as we see this flurry of internet-connected devices. Payment card industry fines, that would be fines and penalties which can be imposed by the payment card industry to companies which are storing or processing payment cards, so be those debit or credit cards. Just a quick recap on our i2Go product. So this is aimed at companies with a turnover below 250 million rand a year, has got pre-underwritten rates and a more simplified proposal form. So please do consider this when you're looking at companies that fall within those targets. We have had a lot of success with this product. We do find that companies are enjoying the ability to take out the cover with slightly less onerous underwriting requirements as we put on for the big corporate clients. Jumping across onto one of the newer offerings on our side, which is our My Solution or personal lines product. We've seen more and more that individuals in their personal capacity are exposed and have cyber exposures. This slide's just got a couple of the key sort of statistics on that. So banking app losses up dramatically to almost 14,500 rand per transaction. Online banking losses over 32,000 rand per transaction. South African Android phones, the second most targeted globally, which is not really a statistic that we should be too proud of. One which still amazes me is that the average age of a cyberbully is 9, and that approximately 58% of children who are bullied don't tell a parent or teacher. That is a very serious problem in our markets and in our country at the moment, and it's actually a global sort of issue. An identity is stolen every 2 seconds, and 1 million children were victims of that in 2019. 2/3 were aged 7 or younger, and 60% of those knew the perpetrator who'd stolen their identity. I think just sort of highlighting that problem a little bit more, there have been, unfortunately, and this is really sad, a number of cases where children have kept quiet as a result of cyberbullying, and it ended up taking their own lives, and some of these at the young age of 13, which is really something which is not not ideal and something which we're looking to try and bring some level of assistance with the cyber insurance policy. The other big one is in relation to the theft of funds. And unfortunately, we see that it's often those who can least afford to have funds stolen from them that are the victim of this. The perpetrators are really smart in the way that they target individuals. Their attacks are very sophisticated in how they will structure them, and they do catch a lot of people out with this. The banks, unfortunately, cannot pick up all of these losses. The example we've got on screen, FNB had done their investigation. There was no evidence of a change to this individual's username and password for their online banking profile. And the easy assumption then is that their credentials have been compromised somewhere, and the bank is then not picking up that loss. If we take a quick look at what my solution covers, the theft of funds cover, which would be the reimbursement of funds from a cyber incident or hacking, identity theft, including the cost to report that identity theft, to take out credit and identity theft monitoring, lost wages if you need to take some time off of work to go and resolve the incident, costs and assistance to help you clear your record, refiling of applications and reissuing of documents, data restoration, malware recovery. There is now a lot of sort of cell phone ransomware that goes about, as well as for your own personal devices, so your own laptops and so forth at home. This module will pick up the cost to restore the data on those devices if possible, and where the device cannot actually be recovered, potentially to replace that device as well. The policy also extends to include the cyberbullying, which I touched on a little bit earlier. What you get under that is assistance with the removal of the content, legal action to try and prevent the bullying continuing, lost wages if you need to take time off of work to go and resolve that issue, a trauma benefit which would assist with counseling costs, additional school costs. If it's determined that the bullying has been to the extent where a child cannot continue in the same school, we'll cover costs for them to move to a new school, things like textbooks, school uniforms, etc. And if you're a celebrity like Justin, you might also have a PR consultant who can help you with some reputational management. On the cyber extortion side, much like you would have on the commercial policy, you have the cost to validate that extortion demand, and if it extends to that point, the cost to actually negotiate and settle the ransom as well. I think just to highlight and touch on these two is that the bullying is not just targeted at children. There are a lot of adults who get bullied. There's unfortunately a lot of sort of revenge porn and all of those sorts of things and extortion off of the back of that. And these modules obviously come in to assist and provide some guidance as far as those things are considered. The network security liability. So if data is stolen off of your device and others suffer some damages as a result of that, this module will pick up the defense and settlement of their liability claims. And this on the reverse with our privacy data breach by a third party. If your data has been stolen from a third party and you've suffered damages, the policy will help with the legal costs for you to institute legal action against them. And in a nutshell, that is our MySolution product offering. We have structured into bundles with varying limits and coverages included, and happy to discuss those afterwards.
Ja, maar ek sê jy moet antwoord as jou fone want dit kan werk wees wat vir jou werk wil offer.
Sorry, if I can just ask everyone on the call, if you don't mind just putting yourselves on mute, that would be great. Thank you very much. I think into the meat of it. So my team and I had the opportunity last week to think, oh, what are some of the tough questions we'd love to pose to the forensic and the legal guys? And Danny and Lee unwittingly decided to sign up for this. So I've got some tough questions to put to them. And what I'll do is I'll actually just hand over to Danny first and then Lee to give a quick sort of 20-second introduction to themselves, and we'll jump into some of the questions that I have put together for them. But I'd also welcome you to put any of your questions into the chat box and we can pose them to those to them as well. So Danny, if you don't mind jumping on and giving a quick introduction.
Thank you, Ryan. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having us. Yes, my background, I started off police force. I was the commanding officer of the cyber unit for the police nationally. I basically started the cyber capacity for the police. And then after that, started my own firm, Cyan. We're currently one of the largest digital forensic capacities in Africa. We specialize in cyber forensic investigations, and we are the guys that's involved in investigations such as the Busasa investigation, the state capture, Oscar Pistorius, those type of investigations, but also on the other side, we assist clients that's being hacked. So although all the work that we do is very, very confidential, just to list for you some of the clients that we helped in the last month that you might have seen in the media. And the only reason why I mentioned them is because it was in the media. We were involved in the Experian, or still involved in the Experian compromise, Stefanuti stocks, Momentum that was compromised or had a problem, as well as Lombards. So we're really active in this environment, and hopefully today we can shed some light for you and your clients on some of these issues.
Thanks, Danny. Lee, if you don't mind, also just a quick introduction, please.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Ryan. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to participate in this today. I've been giving talks to I2's broker clients for many years. I'm just sad we're not all in the same room physically so that we can catch up, but I hope everyone is well. For those of you who don't know, my name is Lee Astfalk. I'm a partner with Clyde & Co. I am an insurance litigator specialist involved in claims against directors, professionals, and including now, given recent trends dealing with cyber attacks. Justin is right. He's not the cleverest person on the panel. The cleverest person on the panel is definitely Danny. So I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say today. But we've also been involved in a number of very serious and complex cyber breaches in the last 12 months, which has really given us insight into the impact that these breaches have on companies, and just how important it is to have a cyber policy sitting behind you. And we'll unpack some of the legal implications this morning that hopefully, as brokers, you can pass those on to your clients when you talk to them about the essential need for cyber insurance.
Awesome, thanks, Lee. So with Danny being the smartest person on the panel, let's pose the first question to him. Danny, just as a quick introduction, if you could give those on the call a high-level overview as to what are the key steps you guys take when you're initially called in and you're responding to a cyber incident.
So basically we see that, you know, when you can picture for yourself, if you come into your office on the Monday morning, you get a call as you drive on the highway and your IT guy tells you, listen, something wrong in our system, everything is encrypted. The chaos that just ensues. We see that this typical attack takes place over weekends, long weekends. They don't wait until everybody is at the office, 10 o'clock in the morning. So we really walk into an environment that is chaotic. There might be board members, exco members, directors that is shouting at the IT department. Financial guys are upset. People can't talk to their clients. So literally we walk into very, very tough situations. The first thing we try to do is just to calm everything down, to try to get context, to start giving structure to that environment, utilizing the client's personnel. So one of the very first things we do is to validate that compromise, exactly what happened. A lot of times we'll see that the IT guys will see that the server is not functioning properly. They'll try to fix it. In the meantime, it's actually a compromise. So we validate that vulnerability. We quickly have a look at what's going on the systems. Is it just a hacking incident? Is it a ransomware incident? What is actually happening in that environment? And we try to contain it as quickly as possible so that it doesn't spread further. Next, what we do is we basically go into a phase where we strategize with the clients in terms of what's priorities. So if you ask a number of people in an organization, what's your highest priority? Finances will tell you the financial system. HR will tell you, you know, managing our HR stuff. The salespeople will talk about the communication with the client. So we need to prioritize what is in the best interest, what's the shortest route to resolving this issue for clients. We go through a process of mapping out. So Ryan has mentioned the ransomware. So we do an assessment very quickly to say, is it going to be cheaper to and easier and more secure to pay the ransom and get the data decrypted? Or, you know, does the client have a backup? So we go through a process of validating all their backups, when last were backups made, We go through a phase of upgrading the security, not upgrading it in terms of bringing new things in, but a lot of times the hackers will disable the security, and we need to get that hackers out of the environment. So we need to eradicate them. We start off with a recovery effort with the client in terms of how do we restore their backups. We assist them with rebuilding the environment. We've all of a sudden become experts in ransom negotiations. I didn't think, when I started off, I'll become an expert in ransom negotiations, but I've done so many. We also assist with Bitcoin as well as making that Bitcoin payments. And I can assure you, when we do this and there's a couple of 100,000 or even millions involved, I don't sleep. You're worried because you're dealing with criminals here. So we literally assist that client in containing the environment, in eradicating the criminals, rebuilding the environment, and getting them up and running and getting their business restored as quickly as possible.
Awesome. Thanks, Danny. Next, and that was a great sort of overview, so thank you for that. Next question, I think ties to this a lot, and we've seen in some instances where we've had some complexities really getting that process rolling, and the longer it takes to really get the process going, what we experience in working together is that the ultimate costs and the damages and the time to get back up and running are a lot worse for the insured. What are some of the biggest pain points or stumbling blocks that you've come across which impacts on the efficiency and the effectiveness of the investigations and the recovery efforts?
I think that the biggest problem is the fact that sometimes client phones us very late. We've seen, and I think you can attest to it, the situations where a client phoned us right from the start, where they give us their cooperation. We are able to resolve that, I want to say 50% faster than where they try to fix the thing themselves. Secondly, also, I think it's more cost effective. It's cheaper if we get involved earlier on because we really know how to manage the situation. A lot of times we'll see the very first thing that happens is the client will phone his IT service provider. So it's an IT problem, you guys sort it out. But you have to remember, this is a situation where if the IT support is basically outsourced to somebody, you are phoning the entity that could have been responsible for this breach. The security was lacked. They didn't update the firewalls, etc. And now you are utilizing them to fix the problem. So a lot of times they're rather looking after their own interest than as to looking after the interest of the organization. So for us, really, the faster we get involved with a client, the better and the easier it is for us to actually resolve that whole situation for them.
Thanks, Danny. Leah, just to make sure that you're still awake, and I thought maybe you thought you were going to get off lucky today, and Danny was going to talk for the whole time. Can you maybe just jump in and give us a little bit of a view as to what role does legal play in the incident response process, and how do you guys interact with and work with the likes of a Cyan and so forth?
Sure, Ryan. So I think the starting point is this. There's a number of implications that flow from a cyber breach. And as Danny's explained, there's a number of things that the target company has to do. And typically they have to do it under fairly extreme time pressure. They've got to identify the data that has been compromised or potentially compromised. And that can be a very challenging task, particularly when you're dealing with large-scale cyber attacks involving transfer of huge amounts of data. Secondly, they have to identify the affected data subjects. And that could be a range of parties. So it could include your employees, your company stakeholders, such as your shareholders, your investors. It could be your customers, your clients, or your suppliers. And once they've gone through that process, they then need to communicate with those parties, and they obviously need to tell them about the breach. And in order to communicate with those persons, they have to have regard to both their obligations under applicable regulations and law. and Poppy is one, which we'll talk about, but there's also other regulatory authorities that potentially might come into play. So for example, if the target company is operating in the financial services industry, they might need to report the matter to the Prudential Authority or the FSCA. And the target company also needs to be mindful of its contractual obligations and arrangements with its clients and customers, because there might well be reporting obligations under those specific contracts that they are required to meet. And they often stipulate time periods within which you have to operate and notify affected parties. So against that backdrop, it becomes crucial that the target company is consistent in its messaging to all these different parties, including the regulators, and that you're absolutely precise and succinct and accurate in terms of what you are saying to all these different parties, bearing in mind, of course, that it's going to be scrutinized very carefully by regulators and others. And the role of the legal team becomes crucial in that regard, because the legal team will consider and review and vet all those communications, liaise with people like Danny and the IT staff at the clients, and ensure that what you're saying is appropriate in the circumstances. The second aspect that's important is that by involving the legal team early, you cloak yourself with the protection of legal privilege. And that's very important. So all communications that are now flowing between the affected company and the cyber and forensic experts, if the attorneys are involved, you gain the protection of legal privilege. And again, that's important, because if you are subsequently the target of a regulatory inquiry or some form of litigation, you've added a layer of protection to your company, and you've hopefully mitigated the risk in that regard. There are other aspects that the legal people will assist with. There are reporting obligations under our criminal justice machinery that one might also need to consider. So for instance, the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Practices Act, PRECA, requires you to make notification to the Hawks where the extortion demand exceeds 100,000 Rand. There are the possible implications and legal implications of the payment of the ransom that Danny has mentioned. And then, of course, there is also the possibility that international legislation such as the GDPR might also come into play. So there's all these touch points that need to be considered. And I think the point that Danny makes is absolutely right, that the instances that we've seen where all of this has been successfully managed is where the target company, the cyber and forensic experts, and the legal team work very closely together, hand in hand, in order to coordinate all of this and in order to ensure that you have the right strategy for dealing with what is a very, very devastating impact on the company.
Thanks, Lee.
Ryan, if I could maybe just jump in there, some of the areas where ourselves and Lee and his team has worked quite a lot with as well. In these situations, there's new things and unexpected legal aspects that just pop up. And if you don't have a lawyer there with you on that, in that crisis situation, it takes so long to actually brief them. So things that jump to mind is, for example, if the company is a listed company, the SENS notifications that need to be made. Where we were quite successful is where some of this information was exported internationally or exfiltrated internationally or published, to use the legal team for takedown notices, so we can secure that information and just prevent it from spreading further. So for me, having a legal team on any of these type of matters just gives me that assurance that somebody else is handling the legal requirements, the needs of the client, the needs of the board, the directors, the interest of the organization and the service providers and their personnel, all being taken care of by the lawyers, and I can focus on the IT problem.
Absolutely, no, it's a good point. And as we said earlier, the sooner we can get resources like yourselves in on the ground, the faster we're able to respond, the less the damages are, and the better off that company is in the long run, the sooner they're back up and trading. So really key to get the right resources on the ground as quickly as possible to reduce the damages and get you back up and running. Lee, another one for you. So over the sort of initial 4 months from the information regulator, or over the last sort of 4 months with the information regulator and POPI now being a lot closer to being fully enacted, the regulator had recorded around 25 data breaches, of which 19 of those were self-reported. Under which circumstances should we or do we need to notify the information regulator?
So Ryan, it's an excellent question. As we know, POPI's effective date is the 1st of July this year, and there is a 12-month grace period within which all responsible parties must bring their affairs into order and ensure by the 30th of June next year they are fully compliant with the Act. The question as to whether there's a strict obligation to notify the regulator at this stage is slightly uncertain in my mind from a reading of the Act. But what we must bear in mind, and I think it's borne out by the fact that there's been so much self-reporting, is that every citizen of this country has a constitutional right to privacy. It is entrenched in our constitution. And POPI was enacted to give effect to our constitutional rights to privacy. And it represents industry best practice. If you comply with the requirements of POPI, you are complying with industry best practice. So that is probably the reason why there's been self-reporting, and I think it's absolutely right. What Section 22 of POPI provides is where you have reasonable grounds to believe that the personal information of a data subject has been either accessed or acquired, you must then notify both the regulator and the affected data subjects to the extent that you can establish their identity. Now, there's some good news in terms of the Act in that it provides some breathing space in terms of making that notification. Because what the Act provides is it says you must do it as soon as reasonably possible, but having regard to two key things. Firstly, the measures necessary to determine the scope of the compromise. And again, that's where Danny and his team become so important, because they will be on the ground investigating exactly what has happened and the scope and the extent to which the responsible party's IT system might have been compromised. And secondly, it allows for the measures that you must take to restore the integrity of your information system. So again, you're allowed some breathing space to make sure that your systems are secure after the breach has happened. And that's a very important one, because we've had instances with Danny and his team and others where you are several days, if not weeks, into the breach, and the hackers are still in the system. And the priority, quite rightly, is to try and secure and safeguard the IT systems of the company. But once those things have happened, you have to report. And it is a judgment call that you will need to make as to when to do it. And that is why it's so important that you work closely with the target company and with the cyber experts to make that decision as to when it is appropriate to report to the regulator.
Thanks, Lee. So no absolute framework as to when you should, but we are looking at various scenarios, and in many instances, even in our responses, have started to notify the regulator to make sure that we are following those best practices. Danny, and I think it's a good sort of segue. We've spoken about some of the claims and some of the actions that have been taken over the last few months. What are some of the latest developing trends that you're seeing in cyber incidents? What sort of attacks are being conducted? What are the implications and the damages from those?
It's actually a very short answer. We're just seeing a rise. We've seen a terrible spike in cyber incidents. I think you guys also saw it in the news. You know, where did we have in the past couple of years so many cyber incidents that reached social media? So the type of incidents that we see, business email compromises, it's basically where criminals are gaining access to emails mainly, and they change the banking details, and money is then transferred into the wrong account. This happens anything from where you're paying out employees' last severance package, his pension payout, or where we've got transactions, trust accounts from lawyers. It's unbelievable how insurance companies and law firms are being hit by these type of attacks because they are dealing with confidential information. So the US Secret Service is estimating that globally we're losing about $300 million per month on business email compromises. That's not the attempts, that's the successful ones where money is actually stolen. Then in terms of the more, the cyber related things, two things that we see there: the ransomware attacks and the exfiltration of data. So number one, they want to steal your data, they want to ransom that to you. And number two, they want to encrypt your data and they want to make money out of that. Now from that, what we've seen in that environment is in the past, they did either one of the two. Now what we've seen in the last couple of instances where we were involved is they first steal the data, then execute ransomware. You think that they didn't take any of your data. They're encrypting the environment to hide their traces, to destroy evidence that we can't trace them that easily. And 4 or 5 days into that incident, they make it known that they actually also stole data. So the whole situation then just worsens to the extent that now you have to deal with, the public aspect also of this data being out, the PR side of it, the legal obligations that opens up. So that is a big trend that we're seeing, is that they are actually doing both of these attacks. And that's why it's also so important that, if a company suffers a ransomware attack, that they don't just restore their backups. We need to establish what the criminals did. What did they take? How did they gain access? Else that company will be a target for many months to come. I think it's one of the worst things to try to defend yourself and say, oh, we didn't know that they took data out. If it comes out 2, 3, 4 months later, that information was actually stolen. And the last thing that we've seen is that the amount that they're charging has just ballooned. To give you an idea, when we started getting involved in ransomware cases, they would ask a half a Bitcoin, 1 Bitcoin. We're talking about something from 90,000 Rand to 150 or 180,000 Rand. Some of the ransoms we've seen the last couple of months or weeks has been to the tune of 88 million Rand. I don't know, we've heard of quite large ransoms that were paid, but when you're sitting with a situation where your turnover of your company or your client's company is 20 million and they're asking for 80 million to decrypt the information, you're going to have to survive without that data.
Absolutely, and I can attest we've seen a lot of those on our side as well. And I think a good sort of feed into the next question is, what are some of the key things that victims could have done to prevent having been compromised, or to then actually minimize those damages once they have been compromised?
Okay. Excellent question. We've got 2 aspects to it. Number one, how do we prevent it? Number two, if it happens, how do we limit the damage? And I think that's a very good approach for any organization. So I'd also like to answer it in that way. So in the IT environment, we basically divided, or from our perspective, we divide our services into 3 legs. The services that assist the company to prevent these attacks. Secondly, how do you detect it? So what are you monitoring in your environment? And then thirdly, how do you respond? And I think it was one of the questions that we also saw that came up. So, and that gives you a holistic approach to cybercrime. A lot of companies would invest their whole budget into let's prevent it. And if you don't look after the other two, so you'll never know that you've actually been hacked, or you'll realize so late that there's nothing that you can do about it anymore. And then also, how do you respond to this? So the respond I'll address in terms of the damages. The prevention that we've seen and the cause of the majority of the attacks is a number of things. So this is where you guys must please take out your pens and take notes, because this is literally where you can improve your own environment, and where you can also give advice to your clients. And it's free. If you ask me this formally, I'm going to charge you a lot of money for it. So the reason why companies are suffering attacks, number one, we're seeing that they've got outdated software. Companies don't want to spend to have the latest and greatest software. The software is outdated. Microsoft is not supporting it anymore. So we see that. Second thing, patch management is not being done. The majority of compromises we've seen is that the firewalls are out of date. Literally what the criminal needs to do. Your school kids can do this. You scan the environment, you look for a specific firewall that's got outdated software. As soon as you see it, you just execute that vulnerability or that compromise in that environment. So patch management, outdated software, open ports on the servers. Still, people are leaving themselves open. And then one of my own favorites is weak passwords. Ryan can attest to this. We're seeing that you might think that you've got a password policy, a strong password policy, where you're forced to change it every week and you can't repeat your password. Even in those environments and in listed companies, we find that password 123, the company's name 123, is being used by 200 to 700 employees on a regular basis. So passwords, we are cracking a company's passwords. I want to tell you, within 2 hours, we crack about 70% of all the passwords that they're utilizing. Then we're seeing that there's not enough cyber awareness amongst personnel. So they don't know exactly how a phishing attack works, those type of things. Investing in awareness for your personnel. Anti-phishing. So anti-phishing is where you can put up filters on your mail accounts to block these type of phishing attacks, because that's how they typically deliver some of their exploits to an organization. And then, so that's the main things that we've seen that led to compromises. In terms of how to detect it, clients should be monitoring their security. We see a lot of times that we get into an organization that there were alerts for weeks or days on end. Nobody looked at those alerts. They just ignored it. They were too busy with fixing printers and ensuring that the desktops are working. And then lastly, how do you respond to this? The way in terms of respond to this is literally how you recover from an incident is up to a couple of things. One, do you have backups? And is that backups offline? A lot of times the client will tell us, yes, I've got offsite backups. When we get there, everything is connected. All their backups is lost. So if something happens to you, how do you recover? You need your data. You need to be able to restore your backups. Two, insurance. I'm preaching to the choir, but you need money to recover from this thing. And then the last thing is the way in which you handle this incident, the publication that you make to the public, to your clients, to your personnel, that determines how well you go through this exercise.
Thanks, Danny. I think some really good pearls of wisdom there. So I hope a lot of people had their pens and papers out and were making some great notes. Right, back to you, Lee. So POPI allows anyone to submit a complaint, including your competitors. As complaints will be public knowledge and must be defended, this could potentially have serious reputational effects and cost implications for those that the complaints are laid against. Do you foresee a risk of a competitor submitting a fraudulent complaint to be of nuisance value, and would there be any potential recourse against such a competitor? Ali?
I think he's frozen there.
Okay, maybe let's go on with one or two more questions for yourself, Danny, while we wait to see if we can get Lee back on the line.
You know, he said from the start he's going to keep quiet and have me do all the work. I think this is a ploy from his side.
Yeah, I mean, you're welcome to answer his questions if you'd like to.
I'll leave it to the legal experts.
So on to another one, and it kind of follows on quite closely from the prior question I'd addressed to you. So if you could give 5 tips for being properly prepared for incident response. So we've spoken about how you can better protect yourself and things to look out for in your own environment and where we've seen the claims coming from. But as far as being able to pull the trigger and have that response process kick off quickly, what would your 5 tips be?
Okay, so number 1, and this would be even my sales pitch. You know, if I
Thanks,
need to
Ryan.
sell insurance, it would be, you know, it's not a question of if this happens to an organization, but when it happens to an organization.
Must be warning.
It sounds like Lee's trying to get through there. Okay, it looks like we've lost him. So if I continue with that, so number 1, I would tell any client, if you are an organization, if you're a private person, you spoke about cyberbullying. I've got kids. Cyberbullying is devastating. You know, even if you are a person that's in a relationship, if somebody gains access to your Gmail account and by some, you know, some situation you had a naked picture of yourself that you maybe sent to a loved one or to a scallompy or somebody, they get that, they start extorting you. It is unbelievable to try and recover from that situation. And kids are taking it very, very seriously. They are committing suicide, you know. So for me, in today's day, we have to say, it's not a question of if this happens to me, but when it happens to me, what will I do? And that's how any organization should approach cybercrime, to prepare for it. Preparation. I can give you 5. Preparation. So number 1, an organization should go through an exercise to identify the type of threats that they are concerned about. Do an exercise to say, if we suffer a ransomware attack, how will we restore from it? Number 1, we need our backups. Check that your backups is safe. You tick that box. Number 2, if we are concerned about somebody stealing our data, how do we encrypt our data? How do we protect it? So you start preparing for these incidents, that when they happen, that we're ready for them. In terms of preparing for incident response, stuff like developing an incident response policy and a plan is really good. Some of the worst things that you can do in a crisis like this is to actually have to appoint somebody to come and help in this incident. You guys, we've seen companies that are scrupulous. They will come into a situation, and if you've lost all your data, they won't even give you a quote. They'll just tell you, listen, this is going to cost 5 million rand to resolve. We've been personally involved in situations where some companies has charged 18 million rand to conduct an investigation into an incident that has occurred. So you don't want to take decisions under or in a crisis environment. These type of contracts should be set up beforehand, like what is done by means of a cyber policy. So develop procedures in terms of who will be contacted. A lot of times we need to contact the board of directors, or we need permission to do certain things. And as I've mentioned, these type of attacks are taking place 2 o'clock in the morning. Who do you phone 2 o'clock in the morning? So we need a communication plan. Who do we phone to get permission? Who's responsible for what? To develop procedures for your personnel. The one instance where we were involved, and it's a nice war story. Ryan, if you see that Lee is in, you can kick me off. But so we got a situation where it was between Christmas and New Year. A big insurance company was hit. One of the execs were still there sending out mails to his clients. And all of a sudden, his email went down. So he picked up the phone, phoned the IT department and said, what's going on? My mail is down. The poor IT guy sitting that side didn't know he was speaking to, and he said, listen, I don't have time to sort out your email. I've got 400 servers that's been formatted. The ex-crew member asked him, did you notify anybody? Because he immediately went into high alert. And the IT guy was one of the younger guys. He didn't have leave. He didn't know what was going on in the organization. He was trying to fix this problem of server after server being formatted. And he didn't notify anybody because he just wanted to fix the problem. In the meantime, there was actually a disgruntled employee that executed code in the environment. And in the end, they lost 800 servers. And still that IT guy didn't know who to notify that something was running in the environment. So, you know, your preparation should be of such an extent that you go through training exercises with your personnel, blue team, red team testing, test that. If a lot of times clients are actually keeping their incident response plans on the environment. Well, what happens if your server is encrypted and your incident response plan is one of the documents that's encrypted? Your contact list. We've had situations where clients couldn't send out emails to their personnel. They've got 5,000 personnel. How do you contact your personnel to say, you guys, we've got a situation? If all your IP phones are down, all your email is down. You know, they didn't even have a database of all the telephone numbers of their personnel remotely. So, you know, going through that exercise and preparing for these things is the best level of defense that you can have.
Thanks, Danny. Agreed wholeheartedly. I did get a message from Lee Shane that had a power failure, so he's still sorting out, trying to reboot and get back on there. But what I'd like to do is there's some really good questions on the message board, so maybe we can pick some of those up while we wait and see if we can get Lee back onto the call. So I'm just trying to run through some of those. Justin, I don't know if there's any that you've picked up from your side that you wanna fire off while I scroll through the questions.
Yeah, Ryan, so we've had some really good questions, so maybe I can just ask you. I mean, I think the first one from Margie Ellison is a really good one, and this is to the underwriter. So Ryan, I guess this is to you, but you know, for many small businesses, the protocol for passwords is not always explained at the underwriting stage, and businesses rely on the IT support to do this. But it seems that incorrect passwords or not sufficient passwords can have a real impact on the cyber cover. Do you have any views on this, and what's a better way to do this? Or how can businesses be sure that they've got the right passwords in place?
100%. So try to highlight at the underwriting stage, and I suppose the difficult thing to always kind of get across as clearly as possible. There are a couple things that one can do, and I think two of the key sort of strategies is one, all about education and awareness. You know, if you educate people as to what the importance of is in having a more complex or a stronger password, not reusing the password you have at work across all of your multimedia or social media platforms, that's a good start. Something to bear in mind on that front is, you know, if you're using the same password you use on Gmail, as Facebook, as Twitter, as Tinder, as your email, you only need one of those profiles to compromised, and all of a sudden this password can be used anywhere. So education is really important. Don't use password, don't use this. And there's a list of a lot of these sort of commonly used passwords. One can circulate those and just sort of educate staff not to make use of those sorts of things. What we have seen is that password length has actually got a massive impact on how easy or how difficult it is to compromise those. And there's a big drive to moving towards passphrases as opposed to passwords. So maybe taking a sentence out of your favorite song or your favorite book or something like that, and actually using that as your password, maybe changing an O to a 0 and a 3 to an E in different places and stuff like that, gives you an incredibly difficult password that will be really, really difficult to compromise, yet should still be quite easy for you to remember. I think we've all had to sit there and try and think of a strange, random sort of combinations of numbers and letters. You never remember it. So, you know, passphrase is a good way to go. There are also free password tools and various tools that can be used by companies to try and pick up if there's any simple passwords. I think you can do a lot around training to try and educate people to use more complicated passwords, but there's still a lot of value in actually doing a test to check to see what comes from that. And we'd be more than happy to work with brokers and advise their clients on what tools can be used to run those sorts of password tests.
One thing that I can jump in as well is we see that a lot of times the culprit is actually the IT department, because they need a password to log into different locations on a server or a network everywhere. And they are the gatekeepers, but the rules doesn't apply necessarily to the IT admin. So we see that a lot of times they don't have really good passwords. And then also where companies are outsourcing their IT, that IT person that's working on your network is using the same password with 4 or 5 of these different clients. If any of those are compromised and they compromise his computer, they jump through to your system, and with his password, they gain access. So even if you appoint an IT person, in the contract, that obligation of using different passwords on your system, that what he uses on his own laptop, should actually form part of your contract. So it's not a simple answer. Passwords are actually really important in this environment.
Absolutely, no, it's a big one.
Great stuff, Danny. Thank you so much for the feedback. Maybe a question to you, Danny. We've had another question from Elaine, and he says, in the event of a breach, does the incident response team take over entirely, or how do you work with the insured's IT department or IT service provider? I think that's quite an interesting question.
It's a really important question. So, the number one for us is, or the best case scenario is, if we at least know a client beforehand. If we've just met them over the phone, that's actually very nice. But a lot of times we'll get a phone call 2 o'clock in the morning to say, go out to company ABC. We've never met them. They need to allow somebody to come in from the outside. Typically, an IT department will see us as a risk, because we are not a risk, but as we coming in to show what mistakes they've made, and we don't want that situation. Also, I can't learn the environment or discover the environment in that situation. So as far as possible, what we try to do is to infiltrate that IT department and assist them in dealing with this. So a lot of times where a client will have no IT capacity, in that situation, we manage the whole thing, we take over. Obviously, we consult with management, and we lead them through the decisions that need to be made. We'll never take a decision on behalf of a client without consulting with them. But otherwise, what I try to do is I identify who's responsible for the firewalls. I want you to check this for me. Who's responsible for the backups? You check this for me. Network guy, I want you to handle this. And we start coordinating who does what. That's a lot of times what we see that clients doesn't have, is that capability of somebody to take control. We do this on a daily basis. So today I'll be working for Sasol, tomorrow for Santam. Next day I'll be working for quite a small organization. So we know how to take charge of what needs to be done, what needs to be prioritized. And that structure that we give assists quite a lot.
I see we have got, so thanks for that, Danny. I see we have got Lee back on the line, and in particular, there was one question I wanted to pose to him around Section 99, because I think it's really quite pertinent. So, Lee, if you could just confirm that you are online and you're good to answer the question.
I'm back, thanks. The wonderful thing about technology is when the lawyers get boring, the Wi-Fi mysteriously goes down. So I apologize for that. But I'm glad you've raised this, because I think from my side, if there's one thing I'd like to leave with the brokers today, it's the impact of Section 99 of POPI. What Section 99 provides quite simply is that if a responsible party breaches the Act, an affected data subject can bring a claim for damages against them. And what's quite frightening about the wording of Section 99 is it says that the affected data subject can bring that claim for a breach, irrespective of whether there has been negligence or intention on the part of the responsible party. Now, us lawyers call that strict liability. And quite simply what that means is that the plaintiff or the claimant doesn't have to establish negligence or intention in order to succeed in respect of their claim. So the burden of proof and the evidentiary burden is far lower for the plaintiff or the claimant. And the flip side of that is that the risk for your clients, the responsible parties who might be met with these legal proceedings, is far higher. And that is why a cyber insurance policy becomes so important, because it will act as a layer of protection against that potential risk. Section 99 goes further, though, and includes some language to the effect that the courts can grant an award for damages that it deems to be just and equitable. And to South African lawyers, we always get uncomfortable when we hear that terminology, because you go, well, what does that mean in reality? And what type of awards might the courts hand down in time when faced with these situations? And the Act provides that the courts can award compensatory damages, but can also award aggravated damages. So again, you know, is our law heading down the road where we might see more punitive style damages being awarded, possibly even constitutional type damages? So Section 99 with strict liability, for me, is the heart of the discussion about liability and risk for companies. And it is something that you must be alerting your clients to as brokers, and advising your insureds of this particular risk.
Thanks, Lee. No, it's a key thing, and I'm glad we got to have you share your views on that. I'm aware we've got a lot of great questions on the news board as well, on the question board as well. One question I wanted to get to before we look at some of those, and Lee, this one will be for you as well. It's something we've heard quite a lot of, and the question that comes up is, well, if I'm using a third-party provider and my data is compromised from there, surely this is their problem and I can't be held responsible for it. Any comments to that?
Sure. So POPI provides and contemplates that responsible parties, those that process information, can use third parties, what they call operators. But the Act imposes upon the responsible party certain obligations in that situation. So they must, A, enter into a written contract with that operator. B, they have to ensure that that operator meets and complies with the safety and security standards that are set out in the Act. And C, they must also ensure that contractually that operator will notify the responsible party in the event of a breach. So as I read the Act, it's not so simple, and you can't just wash your hands if you say, well, I've outsourced to a third-party operator. There are still obligations on that responsible party, and to the extent that they do not meet those regulatory obligations, I can easily foresee situations where they will attract a liability.
Thanks, Lee. Another one for you. You're popular since you've come back online. Maybe you want to stay offline. GDPR. So we know global data protection regulation is the European Union's data protection regulations. A lot of teeth. We've seen some very scary fines and penalties coming out of the EU environment, including a very sizable one to British Airways of late. There's talk that it's got global implications and ramifications. Does it really impact on South African businesses? And how would it actually be enforced that we would have to comply or take actions as required by the regulator?
So the short answer is yes, it can apply to organizations operating in South Africa. It covers any party who is monitoring the personal information of EU citizens or is supplying goods or services into the EU market. So as I understand GDPR, if you are a South African-based operation, say an online shopping company, and you are supplying goods or services into the EU, then potentially GDPR applies. And as you say, it has very scary and hefty fines for a failure to comply. So the Act provides for fines of up to 10 million euros, or a percentage, which I think stands at 2.5 or 3% of the annual worldwide gross turnover of the company. So it's, in terms of South African companies, you have to read GDPR and POPI together in order to determine whether they will apply to your organization. In terms of enforcement, I think, I mean, my understanding is we live in a world where there's just growing regulatory scrutiny. We're seeing far more active regulators. We've seen this in the directors and officers liability space. We're seeing far more cooperation between international regulators. So to the extent that there is a breach, I don't think it would be right and proper for the company here to say, you know, they can't get to us. I think that they would bring legal proceedings locally. And it is something you have to be mindful of. Just one very important difference between the two. GDPR only applies to natural persons. POPI applies to both natural persons and juristic persons. So when you look at the definition of personal information in POPI, it applies to both natural persons and juristic persons. So there is an important difference between the two.
Perfect. Thank you, Lee. I am wary that we have run out of time. So I just want to breeze through one of the last slides. I think we've touched a lot on how the response process goes. And I've chatted to a lot of the brokers previously, and I'm happy to share some comments as to how a cyber policy responds to some recent claims. As we've touched on, a lot of the costs and services that a Danny would be involved in, those are picked up under the policies. Same with Lee, the PR side of things. So I think we've addressed that to a large degree. A topic which is maybe worth a more detailed discussion, but to quickly answer this is, you know, are we seeing hardening cyber market pricing? Yes, we are, both locally and globally, driven in large part by this increase in sophistication that we've seen as far as the claims landscape or the cyber threat landscape is concerned, which is impacted on the claims, the responses around it, the extent of investigations that are required, the ransom demands we're seeing. Things like POPI and the changes in the regulatory environment have required that there's a lot more work done from a legal perspective, engagement with the affected third parties. These things are breaking out into the media a lot more, so you have got the PR element there. And I think we're going to see a lot more on the liability front coming through as well. We will see a lot more litigation coming through. So, you know, the South African market is following the global trend where we are seeing a hardening of the market pricing. And unfortunately it's really just driven by the threat landscape that we're faced with. I think I want to just quickly wrap up the presentation side of things, and then Justin did mention some really great questions. So I'll wrap up the presentation, maybe we can look at some of those questions, but where to from here? Cybercrime is on the rise. South Africa is definitely not immune. We've seen that. All the participants on the panel have acknowledged much the same and spoken to the experiences that they've had. The damages can be significant. Directors are exposed if the response process is not handled properly, if the security is very weak. So good to keep that in mind. Effective incident response, and Danny really sort of spoke us through that, is really important to try and minimize the damages. As I2, we have implemented technologies and solutions that we can share with you and share to your clients to give them a little bit of a view from what their risk looks like. So we've got UpGuard reports, which is sort of an external posture report, and will highlight any sort of immediate red flags in a nice sort of easy read report. So we're happy to run those for your clients and share them with you. And as we saw with the personal line side, you know, the exposure to individuals should not be overlooked. There is definitely implications there from a bullying, a theft of funds perspective. And that's a product that we believe has got a really strong place in the market. Before we delve into the questions, and I appreciate that some people will have to drop off the call for other meetings and stuff. So thank you for your time that you've shared. But I also just like to thank the panelists, both Lee and Danny, for making your time available this morning and really sharing some meaningful insights. I know I've appreciated them greatly and learned quite a lot through this call. I hope that the brokers who've been on the call have also learned a fair bit from the insights that you've shared. So thank you so much for that. It's great as IT to have partners like yourselves that we deal with and that we can rely on to educate ourselves and our broker markets as such. I know looking at the questions a little bit more, I don't know if there's any specific ones that you or Tove want to raise as we move towards wrapping up the call.
Sure, Ryan, thanks a lot. And there've been a lot. So maybe to everyone, if we don't get your question, please just put your email address on the group and we will come back to you. Maybe an interesting one, Ryan, from Dave Hopcroft at Willis. Does I2 have any friendly hackers that can show the clients where they're exposed? And how do we go about this? I'm sure you've got some ideas and tools around this.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's various ways in which you can do those sorts of tests. As I mentioned, we've got the UpGuard situational reports, which we can share. Those are automated and maybe not as in-depth and detailed as you get from something like a penetration test. I2 are also able, and we do offer free vulnerability scans, also an automated test and a little bit more detailed than you'd get from the UpGuard reports. So please do engage with us. We can show you how we go about getting those run. And then as far as the penetration test reports go, we do have various partners we work with and deal with that run those sorts of tests, and happy to put the brokers in contact with those to have those things done.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Ryan. And maybe I'll just leave with two last questions. We've had two really good questions from Renette Carr. So thank you very much, Renette, for the great questions. Ryan, the first question is, how do you know what sum insured to choose? And I know this is a difficult one, particularly if you think about legal costs, incident response, and of course, business interruption.
It's a great question, and one which I've tried to apply my mind to quite a lot. The reinsurance markets have tried to apply their mind to quite a lot. There's unfortunately no magic silver bullet or formula to use. It's driven by the fact that the cyber threat landscape is constantly evolving. There is, the loss history is changing all the time. It's not like some of the more traditional lines of insurance where you have years and years of loss data to go back on. There's also environmental drivers to it. So, things like, well, how complicated is the company's environment? They have a direct impact on how much an investigation is required. How long it's taken you to identify that the incident was there will have an impact on how far did Danny and them need to go to try and figure out what was an initial point of compromise, what data was stolen from there. How dependent you are on your environment will have an impact on what is your potential business interruption claim and how quickly can you recover. So there's unfortunately no magical formula, I'm afraid. What we're seeing is that average claim costs are now starting to look closer to sort of 2 to 3 million rand, which is a significant amount of money. And if I look at what the most common limit purchased with us is in the region of at least sort of 10 million rand. So we're seeing that as kind of the benchmark. And what often happens is we'll quote in a few different limits, and it then comes up to the client to say, what is our risk appetite? And if we went down, how long do we think it would take us to recover? What could we see as potential costs? But, cyber is of a dynamic nature that it's difficult to put an absolute stick in the sand on this is how much you should buy.
Although it's difficult to answer. So for me, some of the takeouts of that response are, you probably need at least 2 or 3 million rand just to cover incident response and having the experts. I2 clients on average are buying 10 million. So that's, I think, a good idea as a starting point. But my advice to brokers would be at least take out 1 or 2 million, a small amount, so that you've got some response and some guidance if anything goes wrong. Ryan, I think we'll take the last question, and this is again from Renette Carr, and I think this is a good pitch for personal line cyber. But Renette's client's cell phone was stolen in the shops at Woolworths. And about 5 minutes later, her business account, her personal bank account, and her credit card were all hacked, and money transferred out. So I think the question is, do you need business and personal cyber cover? And how would a personal cyber policy respond to this? My personal view, again, is that if you have a cell phone, you need cyber cover of some sorts.
Yeah, I think it highlights the need for both, and the business case really for both the personal and the commercial side of the policies. That incident the fact is that the business policy was compromised, business account was compromised, but speaking to the personal side, the policy would look to get involved in that theft of funds if the bank's not going to reimburse that. It's going to look at identity theft because you'll likely find that your driver's license and the like was compromised. You'll get all your sort of alerts to monitor your credit record, costs for reissuing those documents, notifications to the respective bodies to try and prevent any further fraud happening. And you've got the providers who, you know, at that instance, when your wallet or your phone is lost or stolen, it's difficult if your phone is stolen, but maybe you can lend a phone. But there's an emergency response hotline number that you can call, and you get walked through and guided through this whole process to minimize the damages you can suffer. And, you know, just the schlep of the whole thing, because it's a traumatic and it's a difficult experience to go through. So, you know, having the response teams, like we've got Danny and them on the commercial side, we've got the same on the personal line side, who walk you through this process and guide you through and assist you in minimizing what those damages could be.
Thanks very much, Ryan, and I think we'll wrap it up there. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Ryan, our cyber expert, and the panel of experts that joined him. I think this was a really great discussion and session. So thank you to our brokers for joining us. And maybe a last reminder from me that next Tuesday at 10 o'clock is R2's Broker Awards. So please join and listen in. If you're a broker that's been supporting us, we are going to be recognizing those brokers that have become experts in themselves because of their support of our Tuesdays, the good questions, the social media responses. So please join us next Tuesday for a really good session on R2 Broker Awards. Thank you so much to all of our brokers, and Ryan, to you and your panel of experts. Really well done. This was a great session.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate your time.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
And to all of our brokers, I'm sure you're convinced that all of your clients, both business and personal, need a cyber policy. So chat to us, and we'd love to assist. And of course, if you want to put on your microphone and shout out cheers, we'd love to hear from you.
Cheers.
Cheers, Teresa.
Cheers, Justin. Thanks. Lars here.
Cheers, Lars. Great to hear from you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Cheers, Adrian.